Commander Zixt stood on the observation deck of Defense Station Kellar, watching the three suns of Kethara Prime paint the sky in shades of gold and purple. It was the same view he had enjoyed for 15 years of peaceful service. The same view that millions of Kethari citizens woke up to every morning, never imagining it might be their last thought. The first sign of trouble came as a shadow across the smallest sun. At first, the duty officer thought it was a solar flare or debris from the asteroid mining operations in the outer system. But the shadow grew larger, then larger still. "Commander," called Operator Nixra from her station, her usually calm voice carrying a note of confusion. "Long-range sensors are detecting massive objects entering the system. Multiple contacts, size unknown." Zixt H moved to the sensor display, his forearms working quickly across the controls. What he saw made his blood run cold. The objects were huge, each one larger than their biggest space stations. And there were hundreds of them. "Send word to the Council," he ordered. "Priority alert. Unknown fleet entering Kethara space." But even as he spoke, he knew this was no fleet. The shapes were wrong, too organic, too alive. They moved like predators, spreading out in perfect formation to surround their world. And they kept coming more and more, until they blocked out significant portions of the sky. Within hours, the truth became clear. These were the devourers. Every child on Kethara knew the old stories. Ancient machines that had once swept across the galaxy, consuming entire star systems, turning planets into raw materials for building more of themselves. Most people thought they were myths, warnings from primitive times when the galaxy was young and dangerous. The stories were not myths. The first Devourer ship to reach orbit was the size of a small moon. Its surface writhed with mechanical tentacles and processing arrays that glowed with hungry energy. When it began to descend toward the capital city of Vethahala, the planetary defense grid activated automatically. Zixith watched the energy beams lance out from defense platforms scattered across the planet's surface. These weapons could vaporize asteroids and had never failed to protect their world from any threat. The brilliant streams of concentrated energy struck the Devourer ship and simply disappeared, absorbed by its hull like water into sand. "Impossible," whispered Nixra. "Nothing can survive a full planetary bombardment." But the Devourer ship continued its descent, unharmed and unstoppable. The Cathari military response came swift and desperate. Admiral Kexahan launched the home fleet. 60 of their finest ships equipped with the most advanced weapons their civilization had ever created. Zixith coordinated the attack from the defense station, hoping their mobility and numbers might succeed. Where the fixed defenses had failed, it was like watching insects attack a giant. The Devourer ships moved with impossible grace for their size. Their hulls adapted to each weapon strike, becoming immune to energy types they had already encountered. Kethari ships that had served with honor for decades were swatted aside like toys. Their crews lost in seconds. Captain Zolth's ship, the Bright Dawn, managed to score several hits on a smaller Devourer vessel before it adapted. "Commander," his voice crackled through the communication system, "our weapons are having no effect. They learn from every shot. It's like they're alive." "Fall back to defensive positions around the orbital stations," Zixt ordered. But he knew it was hopeless. The Devourers had already demonstrated that their defenses meant nothing to these ancient machines. As the day wore on, the situation grew worse. More Devourer ships arrived every hour, and they had begun the process of harvesting. Massive beams of energy struck the planet's surface, breaking down matter at the molecular level and drawing it up to the waiting ships. Entire mountains disappeared in minutes. The ocean began to boil and evaporate. Evacuation sirens wailed across every city on Kethara Prime. Billions of citizens fled to underground shelters that had been built during their planet's warlike past. when the Cathari had still believed in conflict. Now those ancient refuges were their only hope of survival, though everyone knew they would only delay the inevitable. The Cathari Council convened an emergency session deep beneath the capital city. Elder Vithan, who had led their people for 3 decades of peace and prosperity, looked older than his 200 years as he reviewed the tactical reports. "How long do we have?" he asked. Military advisor Colran consulted her datapad. "At current harvesting rates, the planet will be completely consumed within 18 hours. The underground shelters might extend that to 24 hours at most. What about our allies? The Zentari Federation? The Quillan Republic? The Zentari homeworld fell to the devourers 6 months ago. We thought it was a natural disaster. The Quillan Republic has closed their borders and gone silent. We believe the devourers have been working their way through this entire sector." The chamber fell quiet. The Cathari had always prided themselves on their diplomacy, their ability to solve problems through negotiation and compromise. But you could not negotiate with machines that saw all organic life as raw material. From the defense station, Zixith watched another group of their ships die in feudal glory. The captain of the Star's Edge had attempted a ramming attack against a devourer harvester, hoping to at least damage their enemy before being destroyed. The ship struck the alien vessel's hull and simply crumpled, having no more effect than a bird flying into a building. Emergency broadcasts filled the communication channels. Families searching for each other. Military units trying to coordinate impossible rescue missions. Scientists working frantically to find some weakness in the devourer technology. Children asking why the sky was falling. Through it all, the devourers continued their work with mechanical efficiency. They showed no anger, no emotion, no satisfaction in their destruction. They simply consumed, as they had been programmed to do eons ago, by creators whose names were lost to time. As the second sun began to set, painting the smoke-filled sky red as blood, Zixth realized he was watching the end of everything he had ever known. Tomorrow there would be no Cathara Prime, no Cathari civilization. Nothing but empty space where a living world had once flourished. The thought should have filled him with despair. Instead, he felt a strange sense of clarity. If these were to be the final hours of his people, he would spend them doing his duty, protecting what could be protected, saving who could be saved, even if it meant reaching out to the most unlikely source of help in the galaxy, even if it meant calling on Earth. The idea came from the most desperate mind in the most desperate hour. Elder Vithan sat in the council chambers, surrounded by the leaders of a dying civilization. The emergency lighting cast harsh shadows on their faces as they debated options that did not exist. Every few minutes, the entire underground complex shook as another devourer, harvesting beams struck the surface above them. "We could scatter the population across the colony." "Ships," suggested Councillor Rixall. "Take whoever we can and flee to the outer rim. The devourers would hunt down every ship," replied Defense Minister Holrun. "They have tracked fleeing populations across hundreds of light years before. There is no place far enough to run." "Then we fight," declared General Zekthar, slamming his fist on the table. "We die with honor, defending our homeworld." "We have been fighting," Vethan said quietly. "Our entire fleet lasted less than 6 hours against them. Honor will not save our children." The debate continued in circles, each option leading to the same conclusion: extinction. The Cathari had built their society on intelligence, diplomacy, and advanced technology. They had solved every problem through careful thinking and cooperation. But the devourers were not a problem to be solved. They were a force of nature, unstoppable and merciless. It was young Councillor Nalth who spoke the unthinkable words. "What about the humans?" The chamber fell silent. For a moment, The only sound was the distant rumble of destruction from above. The humans? General Zekthar's voice carried complete disbelief. The primitives from the Sol system? What could they possibly do that we cannot? Nala stood up slowly. At barely 50 years old, she was the youngest member of the council, often dismissed by her elders as idealistic and naive. But her next words carried the weight of absolute desperation. They fight differently than we do. The intelligence reports from our trade missions describe a species that has spent their entire history at war. Not just with others, but with their own planet, their own limitations, their own nature. They have survived ice ages, asteroid impacts, plagues, and nuclear weapons. They are still alive because they refuse to accept that anything is impossible. They are also barely capable of interstellar travel, scoffed Counselor Rixall. Their ships are crude, their weapons primitive. They have no energy shields, no quantum processors, no gravitic manipulation. What could such a backward species do against the devourers? I do not know, Nalth admitted. But in 12 hours, we will all be dead anyway. Do we lose anything by asking for their help? Bethan considered this. The Cathari had maintained minimal contact with Earth for decades, viewing humans as useful for manual labor and resource extraction, nothing more. They were seen as an aggressive, unpredictable species that solved problems through violence rather than wisdom. Everything that civilized people should not be. Perhaps that was exactly what they needed. The quantum entanglement beacon, he said suddenly. We still have communication with the Sol system through the trade network. Commander Zix's voice crackled through the communication system from the defense station above. Elder Vethan, I must protest. The humans have no technology that could threaten the devourers. We would be wasting precious time that could be used for evacuation. Commander, how many civilians have we successfully evacuated so far? A long pause. 17,000, Elder, out of 4 billion. The number hung in the air like a death sentence. At this rate, they would save less than 1% of their population before the planet was consumed. Send the message, Vethan ordered. The quantum entanglement beacon was a marvel of Cathari engineering, capable of instantaneous communication across any distance. It had been installed primarily for trade negotiations and diplomatic correspondence. Now it would carry the last hope of a dying world. Communications Officer Valran worked quickly at her station, encoding the message for transmission to Earth's solar defense network. The words were simple, stripped of all diplomatic protocol and ceremony. Ancient enemy returns. Request immediate assistance. Keth Ara Prime. 17 hours until extinction. She hesitated before sending, looking back at the council. What if they refuse? What if they do not even respond? Then we die knowing we tried everything. Vethan replied. The message was sent. Above ground, the destruction continued. Zixth watched from the defense station as another of their cities disappeared beneath a devour harvesting beam. The machines worked with terrifying efficiency, breaking down buildings, vehicles, trees, and even the soil itself into component atoms. Everything was fuel for their endless appetite. The few remaining military units tried desperate tactics. Captain Morduk led a squadron of fighters in suicide runs against the Devourer sensors. Lieutenant Velana attempted to jam their communications with experimental electronic warfare. Colonel Vexan even tried ramming a cargo hauler packed with explosives into a harvesting beam generator. Nothing worked. The Devourers adapted to every attack within minutes, their ancient programming incorporating new countermeasures faster than the Cathari could develop new strategies. Any response from Earth? Zixith asked the communication officer. Nothing yet, Commander. The message would have reached them 6 hours ago. Perhaps they are debating their response, or they are ignoring us, Zixth finished. He could hardly blame them. What rational species would risk themselves for strangers against an enemy they could not possibly defeat? The hours crawled by. The devourers continued their harvest, working their way systematically across the planet's surface. Whole continents began to disappear. The oceans boiled away into steam and component gases. The very atmosphere grew thin as it was consumed and processed. In the underground shelters, billions of Kethori waited for death. Some prayed to their ancient gods. Others spent their final hours with family, sharing memories of better times. A few continued working frantically on impossible escape plans or miracle weapons that might somehow turn the tide. Most simply sat in stunned silence, trying to process the end of everything they had ever known. Zixth remained at his post on the defense station, one of the few structures still functioning in orbit. Most of his crew had evacuated to the surface, but he and a skeleton staff maintained their watch, ready to coordinate any relief efforts that might somehow materialize, when Communications Officer Tixra suddenly straightened at her station. He barely dared to hope. "Commander," she said, her voice tight with excitement and disbelief. "We are receiving a transmission from the Sol system. It is from something called the Terran Expeditionary Fleet." Zixth had moved to her station quickly. "What do they say?" She looked up at him with eyes wide with confusion and the first spark of hope they had felt all day. "They say they got our message. They say help is on the way. And Commander..." She paused, checking her readings again. "They are requesting our exact coordinates and tactical information on the Devourer fleet. They want to know how many enemy ships they will be facing." "How many ships are they sending?" Tixra consulted her display. 20 vessels, Commander. They are sending 20 ships." For a moment, Zixth felt his hope crumble again. 20 ships against hundreds of Devourer vessels? It was madness. But then he remembered something about humans from the intelligence reports. They were all mad. Perhaps that was exactly what sanity could not accomplish. Perhaps madness was the only answer left. Admiral Sarah Chun was reviewing supply manifests when the priority alert flashed across her command screen. Luna Command rarely received emergency communications from outside the Sol system, especially not through quantum entanglement, channels that cost more than most planetary budgets to operate. The message was simple and desperate. Ancient enemy returns. Request immediate assistance. Cathara Prime, 17 hours until extinction. Chun pulled up the star charts immediately. Cathara Prime was nearly 200 light-years away, home to the Cathari civilization that Earth had maintained minimal trade relations with for decades. They were known throughout the galaxy as peaceful, advanced, and diplomatically powerful. If they were calling for help, the situation was beyond serious. She forwarded the message to Earth Command and waited exactly 43 seconds for the reply. President Martinez's response was characteristically direct. "Admiral, you have full authorization to deploy the expeditionary fleet. Do whatever needs to be done." Chun smiled grimly. This was why she loved serving under Martinez. No committees, no lengthy debates, no political calculations. Just a simple understanding that when people called for help, you answered. Within minutes, the Luna Command Operations Center transformed into controlled chaos. Officers pulled up tactical files that had been classified for years. Engineers ran diagnostics on experimental weapon systems that had never been tested in real combat. Captains, who had been enjoying shore leave, suddenly found themselves racing back to their ships. The Terran Expeditionary Fleet had been Earth's most closely guarded secret for 20 years. While other species saw humanity as primitive and backward, Earth's military had been quietly developing technologies based on principles that more civilized races considered impossible or insane. Captain Marcus Webb arrived at his ship within 2 hours of the alert. The Tay's Indomitable was the fleet's flagship, and like all human vessels, it looked crude compared to the sleek designs favored by alien civilizations. Its hull was covered with armor plating, weapon hardpoints, and sensor arrays that seemed randomly placed. To alien eyes, it appeared to be a ship designed by barbarians to human eyes. It was beautiful. Status report, Webb ordered as he stepped onto the bridge. All systems green. Captain, replied his executive officer. Commander Lisa Park. Experimental weapons loaded and tested. The probability disruptors are showing stable readings, and the kinetic railguns have been loaded with depleted uranium penetrators. Webb nodded. The probability disruptors were humanity's latest breakthrough in physics-defying warfare. Instead of trying to destroy enemy shields with brute force, they altered the quantum probability of the shields existing in the first place. It was a weapon that violated several fundamental laws of physics and drove alien scientists to nervous breakdowns when they tried to understand it. What about the Ragnarok Protocol? Park hesitated. Engineering reports the containment field is stable, but they strongly recommend against using it except as a last resort. The controlled singularity could destabilize if we encounter unexpected gravitational fields. Noted. How many ships are ready for deployment? 20 vessels, sir. The full expeditionary force. Captain Rodriguez has volunteered to take point with the destroyer Defiant. Captain Kumar's cruiser Relentless will handle electronic warfare. The assault ships are loaded with boarding teams and demo charges. Webb studied the tactical display showing the positions of his fleet. Each ship represented years of secret development and the best human military thinking. They had been preparing for this day without knowing when it would come or what form the threat would take. The devourers were a name from ancient galactic history. Machines that had supposedly consumed entire civilizations before mysteriously disappearing. Most species considered them myths. Humanity had spent decades studying every scrap of information about them, because humans had learned not to dismiss threats just because they seemed impossible. Sir, called Communications Officer Thompson, we're receiving detailed tactical data from the Kethari. The Devourers appeared to have adaptive shielding that learns from each weapon impact. Energy weapons become ineffective after initial hits. The good thing we brought kinetic weapons, Webb replied. Hard to adapt to a chunk of metal, traveling at significant fractions of light speed. The human approach to warfare had always been different from their galactic neighbors. Where other species developed elegant energy weapons and sophisticated defensive systems, humans had perfected the art of hitting things very hard with very dense objects. They had turned violence into a science and made weapons out of physics itself. Navigation. Officer Jackson looked up from his console. Captain, I've plotted our course to Kethara Prime. Standard jump routes would take us 6 weeks. We could use the experimental wormhole drive, but the risks. How long would the wormhole drive? 14 hours, sir. But the passage through unstable space could destroy the fleet. No alien species has ever attempted such a journey. The gravitational shears alone. Webb grinned. Officer Jackson, has any alien species ever faced down ancient machine gods with 20 ships and a bad attitude? No, sir. Then I guess we're about to do 2 impossible things at once. Plot the course. The wormhole drive was humanity's most dangerous breakthrough in faster-than-light travel. While other species used careful, predictable jump routes that took weeks or months to cross significant distances, humans had developed a way to tear holes in space-time itself and travel through the resulting tunnels. The mortality rate during testing had been catastrophic, but the few successful jumps had proven the technology worked. More importantly, it worked in ways that made no sense to alien science. Human engineers had a talent for building technologies that violated known physics through sheer stubborn refusal to accept that something could not be done. Within 8 hours, The fleet was ready for departure. 20 ships that looked like they had been built in a scrapyard, crewed by a species that the galaxy considered barely civilized, armed with weapons that should not exist and powered by engines that broke fundamental laws of physics. Admiral Chun opened a channel to all ships. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have received a distress call from an allied civilization facing extinction. The enemy is ancient, powerful, and has never been defeated. Our mission is simple. Get there fast, hit them hard, and save as many lives as possible. Any questions?" Captain Weber of the cruiser Thunderchild raised his hand on the video display. "Admiral, what if we can't win?" "Then we make sure they remember the fight," Chun replied. "And we buy enough time for the Kethari to evacuate their people. Nobody dies alone while Earth has ships to send." The fleet moved into formation around the Indomitable. At Webb's signal, each ship activated its wormhole drive simultaneously. The fabric of space-time twisted and screamed as 20 holes were torn in reality itself. For 14 hours, the Terran Expeditionary Fleet traveled through passages of folded space that drove most beings insane to contemplate. They navigated by instinct and mathematics that existed on the edge of possibility. Ships that should have been crushed by gravitational forces, held together through engineering that bordered on magic. When they emerged in the Cathara system, they found themselves in the middle of a harvest. Hundreds of massive devourer ships were systematically consuming the planet, breaking down everything into raw materials for their endless expansion. The beautiful world that had once been home to billions was already half destroyed, its surface scarred by massive excavation beams. "My God," whispered Navigation Officer Jackson. "They're really doing it. They're eating an entire planet." Captain Webb studied the tactical display. The enemy ships were enormous, each one larger than anything in the human fleet. Their technology was clearly far beyond anything Earth had encountered. By any rational analysis, 20 human ships had no chance against such overwhelming force. "All ships, this is Indomitable." Webb broadcast on the fleet communication channel. "Target acquisition complete. We have approximately 4 billion lives depending on what we do in the next few hours. Remember your training, trust your equipment, and show these machines what happens when they threaten human allies." He paused, then added the traditional human battle cry that had echoed across 1,000 battlefields on Earth and beyond. "Let's go make some impossible things happen." The fleet moved toward the Devourer formation. 20 small ships against hundreds of ancient machines. It should have been suicide. Instead, it was about to become the galaxy's introduction to human warfare. The first indication that something had changed came when every Devourer ship in the system suddenly stopped what it was doing. Commander Zixith watched from his orbital station as the massive harvesting beams cut out simultaneously. For the first time in 18 hours, the destruction of his world paused. The ancient machines that had shown no emotion, no hesitation, no uncertainty in their methodical consumption, suddenly behaved like confused predators that had detected an unknown threat. "Commander," called Communications Officer Tixra, "I am detecting massive energy signatures approaching from the outer system. 20 contacts, moving at impossible velocities. The humans?" "It has to be, sir. But they are traveling through space in ways that our navigation computers cannot predict. They appear to be taking shortcuts that do not exist." On the tactical display, 20 small dots moved toward the Devourer fleet with trajectories that defied physics. They were using gravitational fields as slingshots, ricocheting off asteroid clusters, and somehow maintaining formation while traveling through space that should have torn their ships apart. The lead human vessel opened communications on all frequencies. The voice was calm, professional, and carried an undertone of barely contained violence that made Zixith's skin crawl. This is Captain Marcus Webb of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. We received your distress call. Stand clear of the combat zone. We are about to demonstrate why humans do not make good neighbors for planet-eating machines. What happened next would be talked about in military academies across the galaxy for generations to come. The human ships did not attempt to match the devourers in a traditional space battle. Instead, they immediately scattered into seemingly random patterns and began doing things that no sane military force would attempt. The destroyer Defiant, barely a tenth the size of the smallest devourer vessel, accelerated directly toward the largest enemy ship. Just before impact, it launched every fighter it carried in what appeared to be a suicide mission. The fighters were not attempting to damage the devourer with their weapons. Instead, each one was packed with experimental explosives and piloted by volunteers who intended to ram critical systems. Impossible, breathed Defense Minister Holren from the underground bunker. They are using their own ships as weapons. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled over the human communication channels. Impact in 15 seconds. All fighters report ready. It has been an honor serving with you bastards. The fighters struck the Devourer ship's hull and detonated simultaneously. The explosions were not large enough to destroy such a massive vessel, but they were precisely targeted. Sensor arrays went dark. Weapon systems failed. Harvesting beams flickered and died. But the real surprise came from the destroyer itself. Instead of ramming the enemy ship, the Defiant used the Devourer's own mass as a gravitational anchor, slingshotting around it and launching a spread of kinetic projectiles at point-blank range. The projectiles were not sophisticated energy weapons that could be adapted to and defended against. They were simple chunks of dense metal accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. When they hit the Devourer's hull, they punched through armor that had withstood energy weapons and created massive structural damage. Target 1 is listing to port, reported the Defiant's tactical officer. Hull breaches on multiple decks. Their adaptive shielding cannot stop kinetic impacts. The human fleet immediately adapted their tactics. Ships that had been built with multiple weapon systems jettisoned their energy weapons and focused entirely on kinetic bombardment. They used railguns, mass drivers, and something called relativistic projectile systems that turned everyday materials into planet-killing weapons. Cruiser Relentless demonstrated the human talent for improvisation when it ran out of conventional ammunition. Captain Kumar ordered his crew to fire everything they had: spare parts, furniture, food supplies, and even personal belongings. When accelerated to sufficient velocities, a wrench became as deadly as any military weapon. "Sir," reported the Relentless's weapons officer, "we just destroyed a Devourer sensor array with Lieutenant Harrison's coffee maker." "Outstanding," Kumar replied. "Make a note in the log that military coffee makers are now classified weapons." But the human fleet's real innovation was not their weapons. It was their complete disregard for conventional military doctrine. Where the Kethari had attempted to engage the Devourers in organized formations and coordinated attacks, the humans fought like a pack of wild animals. They used asteroid fields as cover, turned debris into projectiles, and employed tactics that bordered on insanity. The assault ship Berserker actually landed on the hull of a Devourer vessel and deployed boarding teams. The human Marines cut their way inside and began sabotaging critical systems from within. When the Devourers adapted their internal defenses, the Marines simply set off explosives and evacuated, leaving the enemy ship crippled and venting atmosphere. "They are fighting inside the enemy ships," Zixath reported to the Council in disbelief. "They are treating vessels the size of cities like infantry targets." The Devourer fleet began to respond, their ancient programming adapting to human tactics. But every time they developed countermeasures for one approach, The humans switched to something completely different. Captain Singh of the frigate Vindictive demonstrated this when his ship was targeted by 3 devourer vessels simultaneously. Instead of attempting to escape or fight them conventionally, he flew directly into Cathara, Prime's upper atmosphere, and used the planet's gravity and atmosphere as weapons. The pursuing devourer ships, designed for space combat, struggled with atmospheric flight. Their massive size and weight made them clumsy in the planet's gravity well. Singh led them through a series of atmospheric maneuvers that would have killed most pilots, using sonic booms and pressure waves to damage their hulls. When one of the devourers finally managed to lock weapons on the Vindictive, Singh did something that violated every rule of space combat. He flew directly toward the planet's surface. "Singh, you're heading straight for the ground," called Captain Webb from the Indomitable. "Pull up." "Negative, sir," Singh replied calmly. "I am demonstrating the difference between falling and flying with style." At the last possible second, the Vindictive fired its emergency thrusters and pulled out of the dive. The devourer ship, unable to match the maneuver, crashed into Cathara's surface with the force of a small meteor. "Scratch one, ancient machine god," Singh reported. "Who's next?" The human fleet's most devastating weapon proved to be something called the Ragnarok Protocol. The Indomitable had been holding it in reserve. But when a group of devourer ships began to overwhelm the frigate Courage, Captain Webb made a decision that would echo through history. "All ships, clear the target zone," he ordered. "We are deploying Ragnarok." The weapon was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Instead of firing energy or projectiles, it created a controlled singularity, a miniature black hole that lasted exactly 17 seconds before collapsing. During those 17 seconds, it devoured everything within a sphere of space large enough to encompass 6 devourer ships. The ancient machines that had conquered star systems and destroyed civilizations simply ceased to exist, pulled apart at the subatomic level by gravitational forces that humanity had learned to weaponize. "Dear gods," whispered Elder Vethan from the underground bunker, "they have turned gravity itself into a weapon." But the humans were not finished. Even as the devourer fleet began to retreat, pulling back from the planet they had been consuming, the human ships pursued them. They showed no mercy to an enemy that had shown no mercy to others. The battle that should have lasted minutes stretched on for hours. Human ships that should have been destroyed kept fighting through damage that would have crippled any other vessels. When the cruiser Thunderchild lost main power, her crew rigged a manual firing system using spare parts and personal electronics. When the destroyer Vengeance suffered hull breaches, her Marines went outside in spacesuits to make repairs while under enemy fire. It was madness. It was impossible. It was completely, utterly human. And slowly, impossibly, the tide began to turn. For the first time in recorded galactic history, the Devourers were losing a battle. Ships that had never retreated began to fall back. Machines that had never known defeat started to disengage from combat. The ancient enemy that had consumed civilizations was learning what it meant to face a species that refused to accept the impossible. Commander Zixith watched the battle from his orbital station, transfixed by the sight of 20 human ships driving off hundreds of devourer vessels through sheer stubborn determination and tactical innovation that bordered on genius. As the last of the enemy ships retreated toward the edge of the system, he finally understood what the humans had brought to the fight. It was not superior technology or overwhelming force. It was hope armed with the absolute refusal to surrender. And that, it turned out, was the most powerful weapon in the galaxy. The silence that followed the battle was almost as overwhelming as the destruction that had preceded it. For the first time in 36 hours, no weapons fired in the Cathara system. The massive Devourer fleet had retreated to the edge of the system and simply stopped. their ancient programming apparently struggling to process what had just occurred. Ships that had never known defeat in millions of years of conquest sat motionless in space, running calculations that produced impossible results. Commander Zixith stood on the observation deck of Defense Station Kalar, looking out at a sky that should have been empty of everything except devourer ships. Instead, 20 human vessels moved slowly through the debris field, searching for survivors and assessing damage to their own forces. The humans had lost 3 ships during the battle: the destroyer Defiant, the frigate Courage, and the assault ship Berserker. But their crews had not died quietly. Each vessel had taken dozens of devourer ships with them, using suicide tactics that would have been considered insane by any other species. "Commander," called Communications Officer Tixra, "we are receiving a transmission from the human flagship. Captain Webb is requesting permission to dock with our station." "Permission granted," Zixith replied immediately. After what the humans had done, they could have whatever they wanted. 20 minutes later, Captain Marcus Webb stepped through the airlock onto Defense Station Kalar. He was younger than Zixith had expected, perhaps 40 years old by human standards, with the kind of calm confidence that came from surviving impossible situations. His uniform was practical rather than ceremonial, and he moved with the easy grace of someone comfortable with violence. "Commander Zixith, I presume?" Webb extended his hand in the human gesture of greeting. "I'm Captain Webb. Sorry we took so long getting here. Traffic was terrible." Zixith stared at him. The human had just driven off an enemy that had conquered star systems, saved a civilization from extinction, and demonstrated weapons technology that violated known physics. And he was making jokes about traffic. "Captain Webb," Zixith managed. We. How do we thank you for what you have done?" "No thanks necessary," Webb replied, looking out at the damaged planet below. "How are your people? What's the casualty count?" "Preliminary reports indicate we lost approximately 30% of our population during the initial attack and harvesting operations. However, your intervention saved over 2 billion lives that would have been lost in the final hours." Webb nodded grimly. "I'm sorry we couldn't get here sooner. Every ship we could spare was already en route the moment we received your message." "Every ship? You sent your entire fleet to help us?" "Of course. When someone calls for help, you send everything you have. That's how it works." Zixith studied the human captain's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden motives. He found none. Webb appeared to genuinely believe that risking his entire fleet to save strangers was a reasonable thing to do. "Captain, I must ask, why? Our species have had minimal contact. We have offered you nothing that would justify such a sacrifice. Why would humans risk everything for the Kethari?" Webb was quiet for a moment, looking out at the stars where the Devourer fleet still waited at the system's edge. "Commander, has anyone ever told you the story of how humanity first reached the stars?" "I have read your historical records. You developed faster than light travel and began exploring nearby systems. That's the technical version. The real story is that we nearly destroyed ourselves first. Wars, pollution, resource depletion, climate change. We came within decades of extinction. The only thing that saved us was learning to work together against common threats." Webb turned to face Zix directly. "We learned that survival is not a solo sport. When something threatens any of us, it threatens all of us. The Devourers consumed your people today. Tomorrow they would have come for someone else. Eventually, they would have reached Earth." "So you helped us to help yourselves?" "Partly, but mostly we helped you because it was the right thing to do. Because civilizations that stand together survive, and civilizations that stand alone get consumed by machines that see them as raw materials." The conversation was interrupted by an urgent message from the surface. Elder Vifan's voice crackled through the communication system. Commander Zixt, we need you and Captain Webb in the emergency council chamber immediately. The Devourer fleet is moving again. They rushed to the shuttle bay and made the trip to the planet's surface in record time. The underground council chambers were filled with nervous energy as military advisors and scientists studied tactical displays showing the enemy fleet's movements. What's happening? Webb asked as they entered the chamber. The Devourers have been sitting motionless for hours, explained Elder Vethan. Our scientists believe they have been analyzing the battle, trying to understand how they were defeated. Now, they are moving toward the outer system, but slowly, as if they are uncertain about their next action. Military advisor Colran pulled up a detailed scan of the enemy fleet. Captain Webb, we need to know, will they return? Can your forces stop them if they do? Webb studied the display carefully. Honestly, I don't know. We caught them by surprise this time. They weren't prepared for our tactics or our weapons. Next time, they'll adapt. Then, we are still doomed, said Counselor Rixall quietly. They will return with countermeasures for your strategies, and we will all die anyway. Maybe, Webb agreed. But that's not the point. The chamber fell silent. Everyone stared at the human captain, waiting for him to explain. The point is that they know now that they can be fought. That someone somewhere is willing to stand up to them. They've spent millions of years believing they were unstoppable, and today we proved them wrong. Webb walked to the center of the chamber, addressing the assembled leaders. The Devourers succeeded because they isolated their targets. They hit civilizations one at a time when they were alone and unprepared. But what happens when civilizations work together? What happens when the galaxy decides to fight back as one? Elder Vethan understood first. You are proposing an alliance. A unified defense against the Devourers. I'm proposing survival, Webb replied. The Cathari have the finest diplomatic corps in known space. Humanity has the military technology and tactical experience. Other species have their own strengths. Together, we might actually have a chance. Over the following hours, they worked out the framework for what would become known as the Galactic Defense Alliance. The Cathari would use their diplomatic connections to contact every species that had ever encountered the Devourers. Humanity would share their weapons technology and tactical knowledge. Other civilizations would contribute their own unique capabilities. What about the Devourers currently at the edge of our system? Asked General Zekthar. Webb smiled grimly. Leave them to us. My fleet will escort them out of this sector and make sure they understand that this system is now under Alliance protection. As the meeting broke up and plans were made for the massive diplomatic effort ahead, Zixith found himself walking with Captain Webb toward the shuttle bay. Captain, I have one more question. When you arrived in our system and saw the size of the Devourer fleet, did you ever consider retreating? You were outnumbered hundreds to one. Webb stopped walking and looked at him with genuine surprise. Commander, you called for help. We came. The size of the enemy fleet was irrelevant. But your crews could have died. Your entire fleet could have been destroyed. Yes, and if we had run away, your entire civilization would have been destroyed. Sometimes the choice is not between winning and losing. Sometimes the choice is between doing what's right and doing what's easy. They reached the shuttle bay, where Webb's transport was waiting to take him back to his ship. As he prepared to leave, he turned back to Zixith one final time. Commander, there's something I want you to remember. Today, 20 human ships drove off hundreds of Devourer vessels. But that's not the important part. What is the important part? The important part is that when your people called for help at the last second, someone answered. And from now on, whenever anyone in this galaxy calls for help, they'll know that the Alliance will answer. The days of civilizations dying alone are over. Captain Webb's shuttle departed, carrying him back to his fleet and their escort mission with the retreating devourers. Zixith watched until the transport disappeared from view, then made his way to the communication center. He had a message to compose, one that would be sent to every corner of the galaxy, a warning to other species about the return of the devourers, an invitation to join the new alliance, and a promise that no civilization would ever again face extinction alone. But first, he sent a personal message to Earth's Solar Defense Network. Message delivered. Reply received. Thank you for falling from our sky like thunder when we needed you most. As Cathara's 3 suns began to rise over a world that would see another dawn, Zixth realized that the galaxy had changed forever. Not just because an ancient enemy had been defeated, but because the scattered civilizations of the stars had finally learned what humans had always known. Sometimes salvation did not come quietly. Sometimes it fell from the sky with railguns blazing and impossible weapons armed with nothing more than absolute determination to do what was right.